Okay, in this first um, um, part of the podcast we'll be talking about a time when Christianity was opposed to science. Uh, the picture there of the Galileo, exactly, it was at that time Christianity were actually using science, and that caused the problem with Galileo. But we're going to go back to a time before that. Now, you hear, or many tell us today, that the Bible is not a scientific text. In fact, those who do this often give us this picture and say, here's what the Bible teaches: this vault between the skies and the columns of the earth below this. This was an ancient understanding of science, but which was the world view of the ancients in the Bible follows that worldview. Uh, Actually, in my view, these scholars are just protecting their way of reading these ancient texts into the Bible. They might not be reading these ancient texts any better than they read the Bible. In fact, that's certainly not how I read the words of the Bible. Uh, the Bible that I read, it teaches about the same visible world as we observe today. It does, however, it doesn't use the theoretical language of science. It doesn't say anything about a lot of the details of how the world looks. It rather uses the concrete language of the visible world. And so this will not change no matter what the science is. The world is still going to look more or less the same from from age to age. But what the Bible does teach about God's creation is essential for the most useful kind of scientific understanding. Um, the Bible, I asked some of these people who are saying that, well, are you, what do you mean by that? The Bible definitely is a historical text. Miracles, the truth of the Bible is based on these miraculous historical events. Now, miracles cannot be scientifically explained. If miracles could be explained, science could explain miracles, they would not be miracles. They might be sorcery, they might be technology, but if they're truly miracles, they cannot be explained. Nonetheless, these miraculous historical events serve as singularities or boundary conditions that are essential for the historical sciences. And so, if you ignore these miraculous events in the Bible, whether it's creation event or the flood or these are the things that affected the natural world. Most of the miracles of the Bible didn't leave a lot of physical evidence, even though the Jesus' resurrection, it left the empty tomb for people who did not see Jesus. They had that to, how did that happen? How did, this guarded tomb occur? Now, it's important to understand what the Bible translates as wisdom includes the things that we call science. The Bible, of course, commends and teaches wisdom. Now, the two people that were the Moses or God instructed down to build the Ark of the Covenant, and they were Bezalel and I forgot the name of the one from the tribe of Dan, but they had the skills in crafting this ark, and the Bible referred to that as wisdom. The Bible, as everyone knows, commends wisdom, especially the book of Proverbs. For the Lord gives wisdom, and from his mouth comes knowledge, understanding, and Proverbs. So the Bible is not, doesn't recommend. I mean, it recommends that we obtain wisdom, even though Jesus says the children of this world have more wisdom for their own way, or they're wiser than the kingdom of light. And of course, the serpent or the devil is also classified as having wisdom. and we're to be as wise, innocent as doves, but as wise as serpents. But just the basic teachings of the Bible are very important for science or anything else to understand God as the invisible creator and ruler of this world. Is not self-existent. Someone created it, and someone is invisible is not in charge. I mean, there is in charge of what goes on, and so it tells us scientifically about the origin of the world, and of course about the origin of man, and the origin of various nations, uh, and then about the benefits of knowing and serving God. When you try to do a social science that ignores these things, you'll get in trouble. This includes the morality and order of the family and the world, which we may think is outmoded knowledge, but we may find out that these are universal truths. And of course, even it's important, people ought to know about God's present and ultimate judgment for the things done while in the body. The Bible, of course, also refers to, as I mentioned earlier, practical wisdom, skills, know-how, and technology, things that we more associate with science. But instead of specialized abstraction, the Bible uses everyday language and not a lot of technical or philosophical term. Another thing that makes the Bible good for science is that Christianity or the Bible teaches us not to look down on manual labor, and when we're the Greeks, for example, looked down on people that worked with their hands. That was slaves. They were above all that. But it's working with your hands that you actually learn about the physical world, and you can improve science from that matter. But the Bible, in addition to working with the land, the Bible itself requires literacy, and the Bible is responsible for literacy going to the masses, to everyone and everywhere. But there's another kind of wisdom that is needed for governing, and so if Christians are going to ever participate in governing the world, they need to know a little bit about the world. Now, the Bible has wisdom that can be applied to the world. Joseph, because he served God, he was able to meet the needs of a great famine that was coming in Egypt, and he was recognized by the Pharaoh as having this wisdom. And then it works the other way too. Moses was trained in the wisdom of the Egyptian, which the other Israelites, especially at that time being slaves, they did not have. But of course, the one in the Bible that's most associated with wisdom is the writer of Proverbs and in Ecclesiastes. That's Solomon, and Solomon's wisdom. You need to know the nature of man, the fallen nature of man, which Christians don't necessarily. They might not be as experienced with this, but if you're going to be a king, you have to know that. But Solomon also studied and taught about things that we'd call scientific biology, things about nature. We don't have a lot of this recorded, but it may have been imparted to the ancient world. We may have gotten in another direction. And of course, we know the case of Daniel and the 3 Hebrew boys that were taken into captivity. They came from probably the royal family or priestly families, but Nebuchadnezzar wanted these highly trained people in his service, but they had to be trained into the knowledge of the Babylonians, and so they were not just the knowledge they had from serving God and what we know in the Old Testament, but they also had to learn what the things that the Babylonians believed in order to govern provinces for the king. Now let's go to science. Now, science as a source of knowledge presumed superior to religion, and it often, even today, much our secular world generally tends to believe that science is superior to religion. That's why it has such authority today. Now, this attitude begins with Aristotle, or actually, Aristotle was the culmination of this type of thinking. Aristotle dates to the 4th century BC. Now, that's about the time of Ezra and Nehemiah in the Bible, so it's kind of late as regard to the Old Testament. But he was a student of Plato, and who really is the most influential philosopher in history. Alfred North Whitehead said the entire history of philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. But Plato's teacher was Socrates. Now, Socrates and Plato, they're maybe about the time of Esther in the Bible, about the time when the Persians are ruling most of the Eastern world, and sometimes they're fighting with the Greeks in the classical era of Greece's history. Now, the philosophy didn't start with Socrates. It started with what we call the pre-Socratic philosophers. They were trying Hesiod, for example, famous Greek writer. He and others, they were trying to bring order to the ancient myths of that were taught by what you read in Homer, and trying to make sense of them. And philosophy came out of trying to make sense of these different different mythological myths, we call them that way, or their stories. Maybe there's a little bit of truth to some of them that's preserved in some of them, but basically they're not things that we would believe. But a lot of the philosophical terms come from this language of ancient myths. Now, what makes Socrates so important is that he's confused. In fact, Socrates is the one Greek philosopher that I most admire because I identify with him. He just doesn't understand what he's being taught. Or he has questions and nobody can answer these questions. So, in fact, there's a story that Socrates had heard that the Oracle of Delphi had said that Socrates is the wisest man in the world, and that really upset Socrates because he didn't think he knew anything. So he goes to the Oracle and asked about this, and he said, "Why are you saying this? I don't know anything." And the Oracle of Delphi says, "Well, you know one more thing than the others know." So Socrates had had all these questions, and some of them including doubts about the gods or what was taught about the gods. So Socrates was his citizens of Athens required him to drink this cup of hemlock, basically commit suicide for doubting the gods. But there was a bunch of young kids around Socrates, including Plato, and they were influenced about him. And Plato was really he developed a system of philosophy to replace all these myths that the Greeks were being taught. But there was a lot of the followers of Plato became famous for being skeptic. Skepticism came out of that. They're doubting. They're looking at this world. Of course, Aristotle was one who was doubting of the religion and wanting to replace it with philosophy, actually a kind of philosophy that we would today call science. Now, Aristotle was what made him so influential as a philosopher is that Alexander the Great, who conquered the world, he was Aristotle's pupil. You see him sitting on the chair listening to Aristotle. And then after he's conquering the world, he becomes Aristotle's patron. So he sends Aristotle back books and information of animals and different the Greeks had never seen, but all over the world they're coming there. So Aristotle has you might say, a museum and a library in which he can give us opinion on everything. The in fact, almost like if its opinion became science, it's a little bit like a know-it-all. But Socrates had the information on everything. But now in this time of Alexander, uh, after Alexander conquered the world, we call this the Hellenistic era, and it was a time when science in the ancient world, as we know, was at its peak. Now, it began when Alexander conquered the world about 321 BC. I've extended this into the early Christian era, through the Roman era, because the learning people during the Roman times, which is the time of Jesus and the time of the early church, the learned world was still Greek speaking. Even the church in Rome spoke Greek. Uh, but this is a time when we have, for example, Euclid, mathematics. Really, you might say that he was a founder of mathematics. Well, maybe from Pythagoras was really interested in mathematics as well, the Pythagorean theory. But Euclid developed a system of mathematics based on that, and which is still through the ages has been used as a foundation of mathematics. Archimedes, on the other hand, he developed the principle of the lever, or what we say the mechanics or physics. He may be the father of that, and this had some practical value, especially because and the Romans wanted to use this for military warfare. He was helping the people of Syracuse, and the Romans wanted to capture him, like the Allies wanted to capture these Nazi scientists and get their knowledge of rockets and that type of thing. The Romans wanted to capture Archimedes, but they accidentally killed him, so they lost his advantage. Another was Apollonius of Perga, who developed the conics, geometrical shapes. And then, of course, there's the fathers of medicine, Hippocrates and Galen. And even today, the Hippocratic Oath, named after Hippocrates, says the first thing is do no harm. And that medical wisdom needs to be better followed. It's supposed to be, doctors are supposed to still follow that, but unfortunately they don't, and they don't test things. But a lot of the early medicine skepticism derives from that. And if you know anything about all the things that have been proposed in medicine, there's a reason for skepticism in medicine. And of course, Galen was another famous. And then the astronomy, the most famous astronomer at this time was Ptolemy, who kind of followed Aristotle, but he said, well, if you look at the planets and observe them, if they're going around the sun instead of the earth, it would simplify things. But he still believed the earth is still the center of the universe. But he was an influential astronomer. And then there was Aristophanes, who actually did a pretty good job measuring how big the earth, how large the earth was. They knew the earth was round. There's a lot of myths, about the ancient people not knowing a lot of things that they actually did know. So science was in a pretty advanced state during this Hellenistic time. Now, why all of these are Greek speaking? Now, I have an idea that science, we see this science right now for the same reason as Aristotle is getting all this knowledge. This is coming at a time when the Greeks are getting the knowledge in the ancient world. Some of this knowledge may have actually come from Solomon or from Persia, the influence of all that. But we don't have any of those books because they weren't preserved. The only thing that was preserved were things that were written in Greek, or mostly what was preserved, because that was the language of Christianity. So Christianity not only the Christians not only preserve the Bible uh, and those books, but they also preserve the writings of the Greek writings because they could read them. So we're uh, the Greeks look maybe smarter than what they actually are. Not that these were not excellent at what they did, but they didn't necessarily. It was not in the Greeks. It was knowledge among the Greeks was very competitive. You had to pay for it to learn from various philosophers and scientists because they made money on this, and they didn't want to tell anybody where they got this, and but how much of this, it's really not that important. But at least ancient science gets passed to us through the writings of these Greek scientists. Now, except for Aristotle. Now, the Christians did not like Aristotle. And why was that? Well, one thing is Aristotle was scientific, or he was materialistic. He denied the invisible world. Plato believed there was a world that existed in invisible forms, but Aristotle denied that there was what we see is what exists. Does that sound familiar with some of what some of the atheists want to tell us today? Aristotle said nothing exists except what can experience through the five physical senses. And of course, in this case, if the world is materialistic, when the body goes, the soul goes, the person goes. So he denied that, and that so the Christians didn't want to deal with that. But there were other things that we need to know about why Christians reject it. One thing is Aristotle's astronomy was essentially astrology. The stars determine the fate of people. So that's something that modern science rejects, but it was part of Aristotle's science. And of course, Christians rejected that because they believed in free will. The early Christians did anyway. And it includes what alchemy, or what was then called sorcery. Let's see if you can compare this with, witchcraft. uh, with these various powers. When we hear about Francis Bacon, who is the modern science champion, had this famous statement: "Knowledge is power." Actually, Francis Bacon at that time during the Renaissance, he may have been something different from what we think of in terms of science. He may have actually been talking about the powers that the not necessarily magical powers, but certain powers, and of course, magic and incantation of words was part of all this, and so Christians didn't want to have anything to do with that. Now, philosophy in general, they did not have so much trouble with it. In fact, philosophers and intellectuals were some of the first people to be attracted to this new faith, Christianity. Even before the apostles, we had this Jewish philosopher named Philo. He was very interested in Plato, and he claimed that Plato got his teachings from Isaiah or someplace. Actually, he's trying to reinterpret the Old Testament more like Plato. He was really given the fact that God in the Old Testament appears as in the form of a form of man, or man is made in the image of God. That wasn't, philosophers didn't particularly like that, and Philo tried to explain that away. He also wrote about this group of people in Alexandria called the Therapeutai, or the healers. And he was fascinated about them. He called them philosophers, but when I read that, I'm pretty certain that he's talking about the early Christians. And maybe from the day of Pentecost, you can see his time period overlaps the beginnings of Christianity. Now, the early Christian father that I really identify with a lot He started his career as a philosopher, just a martyr, but he couldn't get the answers like Socrates couldn't get the answers, and he realized that Christianity could provide the answers that philosophy could not. But even as a Christian, he wore his philosophical robe. He just said Christianity is the best philosophy. Now, another reason why the Christians were looked with favor on some of the philosophers is just as Socrates was put to death or persecuted for atheism, so were the early Christians. That was the main charge among the Gentiles or the pagans, that the early Christians, they did not believe in, they refused to worship the gods. They were called atheists, and they were many of them were martyred on account of that. Maybe as a result, Clement of Alexandria, one of the earliest fathers from the latter part of the 2nd century, he saw philosophy as a preparation for Christianity. In fact, it was different kinds of philosophy were so popular in trying to interpret Christianity and with these different philosophies. One of the church fathers, Tertullian, made this famous statement: "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem? Basically, what has philosophy to do with the Bible?" That's a very, very good question. Tertullian himself also had a kind of a spiritual materialism kind of philosophy, but he recognized that there were two different kinds of systems. But one of the most famous of the church fathers, Origen, in the 3rd century, he follows like Philo, and he's trying to interpret Christianity in terms of Plato. And he actually taught reincarnation, and based on that, it's the survival of the soul, and universal. Now, what you now read about some of the Eastern religions like Hinduism or Buddhism and their reincarnation, I'm almost certain that that's a result of Alexander the Great and these Greeks ruling, conquering India. You don't really have any surviving writings about reincarnation that date before Alexander's conquest of India, and the same kind of the world's not real that you see among the Eastern religions was kind of like Plato, because Plato didn't have. Now Plato did, unlike Aristotle. Aristotle believed the world was not created, but Plato recognized he had a god he called Demiurge that Christians could, like Origen, could associate with the God the creator God of the Bible. And of course, Plato taught the invisible heaven. Plato had a heaven, even though it's a little different from the Christian era. And of course, the eternity of the soul comes out of Plato's teaching. But again, so does, in fact, Gnosticism is really trying to subsume Christianity, the teachings of the Christians under Plato's thought. Again, a lot of it was despising the flesh, but it did appeal to a lot of these African, like following Origin, the Desert Fathers. The tendency to despise the flesh was part of that. Now the Gnostics proper, they said, well, Jesus was a secret teacher. That's where secrecy of the Gnosticism comes from, and they didn't like the Old Testament. They didn't like the history part of the Bible and Christianity. They wanted to make Jesus into a teacher, kind of like maybe liberals might want to do today. But the important thing is, now, Augustine, who was one of the most influential of all these early fathers, he interprets the Bible philosophically. In fact, he was a member of a Gnostic sect, the Manichaeans, before he became a Christian, and then after that, he became a Neoplatonist, and Neoplatonism, in addition to teaching determinism or fatalism, it also teaches the flesh as being sinful, and this this had a big impact on on Christianity. He did away with a lot the eschatology of the Bible and saw it basically as the world is Christian. It was the Neoplatonism, unlike Plato itself, taught an emergence of the world. So he taught an eternal plan, as he published in the City of God, which is similar to the plan of the Bible, except it's a everything's predetermined. There's nothing, it's in a way philosophical or scientific rather than historical. Now, uh, during the Dark Ages and Middle Ages, this Neoplatonism was the main theological thinking in there, but the Christianity at this time was divided between the Greek-speaking East and Christianity in the West. This is called uh, the Latin-speaking West and the Greek-speaking East, but the Dark Ages occurred in the West. Now, I'm going to go right now to the church in Britain, which was part of the West. Latin was a missionary language for these what they then called the barbarian nations. And in Britain, it was right on the edge of the Roman Empire, so Christianity could actually move into the non-Christian parts. And they're not getting their Christianity out of Rome, even though it's Latin, because the church in Rome was Greek-speaking. But the Latin Christianity begins in North Africa and Spain, but especially Britain. I'm almost certain that the old Latin translation of the Bible is mostly coming out of Britain, because Britain and later Ireland became the first center of Latin Christianity and literacy. What made the Christianity there differ, they were kind of like missionaries when they went there, and missionaries, of course, don't go with armies. And so it's coming up from below. It's not from the kings and imposed on the people like what would later happen, say, with the Germans and working with the Bishop of Rome. When the king converted, the people converted. But in Britain, it's coming from what we would now think of as missionaries. Now, and these missions later turn into monasteries. Now, we could know that they're not the celibate monastery as we later see, because, for example, St. Patrick, who converted to Ireland, his father was a priest. So he's part of this British Christianity. And basically there were just families, there were missions, but the people who let me first mention, there's evidence even from the first century of common literacy in Britain. There's in a Roman fort just some years ago, they discovered these tablets that were written by the wives of some soldiers and just ordinary people, which almost definitely tells you they were either Jewish or Christian. At this time, the Romans were fighting wars in Judea, and they were fighting wars in Britain. And of course, some of these soldiers from one place, they may marry, and they would take their wives to another place. But we see evidence of common literacy, and it's almost certain that, in fact, Tertullian mentions Christianity outside the Roman Empire in Britain. From the 2nd century. Origen mentions that the Christians were bringing peace between the barbarians and Romans in Egypt, because they were it extended from both places, and they could serve as a way of bringing peace, which they would for many, many years. But at this time, a Christian was the same as someone who could read and write. The Christians who lived in these missions were called clergy. They would teach people that were not part of the common life, and which we would call them lay people. But the word clerk comes from the clergy, or which at that time was essentially the Christians, and so the word clerk came to mean somebody who could read and write. Uh, but now all learning, here's what's important: all learning here in the West, because Aristotle was prescribed and it's Latin, and most of these Greek teachings and writing on philosophy and everything. The only thing really they had was the Old Testament primarily, and well, the Bible, the entire Bible. But the Old Testament was part of Christian history then. It was not. It was not a. It was not a kind that looked down on the Christianity. They looked the Christians in the early Christians, especially those in the West and in Britain. Uh, I mean, the Old Testament talked about kings and how kings had to obey God. You didn't have that in the New Testament, so it was just the Bible. Um, Another way to think about Christianity at this time in early Britain is early American Christianity, where it was about the same thing. They just had the Bible. All the great universities and learning was in Europe. If you compare later Europe to the Greek East and America to the Latin West, you'll kind of understand the early church and mission. Now, the West, when the Roman Empire, later Roman emperors divided the nation just before Christianity, the Bishop of Rome was kind of left by himself in Rome when Constantine moved the kingdom to Constantinople. And the Bishop of Rome had more independence for that reason. The Bishop of Constantinople were under the thumb of the emperor, and so were the patriarchs in the East. But this is also the time of the Dark Ages, at the fall of Rome, the barbarian kings who couldn't come in, and they started controlling the church, and they couldn't read and write. So literacy disappeared from Rome during the Dark Ages. But uh, uh, the okay, by the way, the Roman church finally gets to Britain in 597 BC, but Christianity had been up there for 500 years, but it was a grassroots kind of Christianity, and that's one of the reasons we don't hear a lot about it, because the later English church, the Anglican Church, which was the first Pope Gregory sent Augustine, another Augustine. This is not Saint Augustine of Hippo that we were talking about earlier, but this is Augustine of Canterbury, and up to and he had some of the teachers they sent to Britain had more learning, because the British, that was something that appealed to them, because literacy has literally disappeared from Rome during the Dark Ages. And Britain and Ireland, most people have heard about how the Irish souls saved Christianity, but it was really Charlemagne, the king. He goes to Britain and gets teachers. He wants his kings to be able to read and write, so he comes and establishes universities. They were begun in towns and cathedrals. Now, there were two kinds of clergy later on. There were the clergy controlled by the bishop, the pope, and these were the religious clergy. And then there was the clergy that were the bishops that were controlled by the kings. That was the secular clergy. So you had both types, and sometimes they were competing with one another. But this overall gave more freedom in the West under the under the Roman Catholics than existed in the East, in which everything alternative teachings that were not coming from the emperor, especially from the time of the later Byzantine empires. But you had a great differences in teachings allowed due to in the West. But even the canon law, the church law that the Catholic Church had, it served kind of like the Supreme Court in America. It could resolve conflicts between kings. It's maybe a little worldly application. We don't think about it in terms of maybe the type of Christianity we have now. But it served the West and brought peace, even though they're really there's a lot of fighting between these kings and a lot of stuff coming on. But the church is gradually bringing a measure of they're all recognizing it's combine the church in Britain and the church in Rome sort of work together um, to make for a more peaceful and prosperous West. This is why during the backward West, during the Dark Ages, they didn't have science, but they had the Bible. But this peace is allowing travel and trade more between nations. As Christianity spread, uh, slavery decreased. These early missions, the people had to have some degree of freedom, and of course they had children, so there were free people in the West. But those who weren't freed, when the king, that were slaves, they couldn't be. If they converted to Christianity, they could no longer be slaves. But of course, most of them they was replaced by serfdom. But serfdom is still a better situation than a pure slavery, and that's of course serfs couldn't move around. They had and they were ruled by their lords and things. But you had some people that could these towns they allow more freedom, and there were larger markets and these greater markets and this more peaceful travel allowed for specialization. Adam Smith talked about how when you got a bigger markets, there's more specialization, so there can be improvements in industry. The horse collar, for example, was invented during this time, and that allowed the horses could pull could plow deeper, and agriculture productivity increased. Water wheels were developed for grinding corns, and of course clocks, which were used for church bells and timing of prayers, and that they so mechanical science developed here. Blacksmithing improved, and so you see there. In fact, there's something called a medieval industrial revolution, and some of the Cistercian monasteries, they they wanted more time to be able to pray and to read and write, so they developed labor savings, and a lot of the technology was developed by the monastery. So the Crusades show that the prosperity and power of the West exceeded that of Greek East. Now, the West couldn't, the Muslims could not conquer the West because they were stronger than the more learned East. So this ends the section on when Christianity did not have science, but it did have the Bible, and the West became what we now call the West. A lot of people don't. What do we mean by the West? The West is the Latin-speaking world, which was mostly Roman Catholic, and the East is the Greek-speaking East. So when you hear the term West, what does West mean? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about the world that comes from the Latin speaking West, and most people who use the term Western today, they don't know what that means. So this is the second, the first part on Christianity when Christianity did not have and did not want science.